Close your eyes and imagine a medieval battle. What do you see? Probably an immense plain filled to the horizon with colossal armies, tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of soldiers clashing in a tide of steel and banners, like a scene from The Lord of the Rings or Braveheart. It's a powerful, epic image and almost completely false. The stark historical reality is that most of the armies that fought in the Middle Ages were surprisingly small, so small that their numbers would leave you speechless. Let's take as an example one of the most decisive battles of all time, the Battle of Hastings, in 1066, where the future of England was decided. William the Conqueror and King Harold faced each other with forces that modern historians estimate at about 7,000 to 8,000 men per side. In total, fewer than 16,000 combatants. To give you an idea, that giant army that changed an entire kingdom wouldn't even fill Madison Square Garden today. And this is not an isolated case. Even at the famous Battle of Agincourt during the 100 Years' War, the English barely numbered more than 6,000 men. The chronicles of the time often spoke of innumerable hosts, but this was more propaganda than an accurate count. Archaeology and the analysis of logistical records tell us a very, very different story. This fact changes everything. It forces us to understand that medieval warfare was not a game of massive numbers, but something much more personal, limited, and often desperate. It wasn't about annihilating the enemy with human waves, because, quite simply, there weren't any. So here is the question that will guide this entire video. If kingdoms had populations of hundreds of thousands or even millions of people, why could their kings barely gather a few thousand soldiers for the most important campaigns? Where were all the people? Why was it so incredibly difficult to raise a large army? The answer lies not in a lack of men, but in the very structure of medieval society. In a world without permanent professional armies, everything depended on a delicate pact of loyalties and obligations.
Okay, so we've seen that medieval battles weren't the festival of extras from a Hollywood blockbuster. But then, how was an army assembled? The answer lies not in a ministry of defense, but in a handshake and an oath. Welcome to the feudal system, the most dangerous social network of the Middle Ages. Imagine you're the king. You don't have a centralized state or a national budget as we understand them today. Your greatest wealth is land. What do? You hand it out. You give a huge piece of land, a fief, to a trusted noble. In return, he kneels, places his hands between yours, and swears to be your vassal. This oath is the heart of it all. It's the contract that says, I give you land to live like a minor king, and in return, you give me military service when I call. But here comes the fine print, the clause that changes everything. That service wasn't forever. The most common obligation was for military service for 40 days a year. 40 days! In that time, you have barely enough time to gather your troops, march into enemy territory, besiege a castle for a couple of weeks, and get back home before everyone says, my contract is up, I'm leaving. This made long strategic campaigns almost impossible. And the problem multiplies, because that great duke you gave land to does the same with lesser counts and barons, and they, in turn, with knights. This creates a pyramid of loyalties. A common knight didn't owe direct allegiance to the king, but rather to the lord who guaranteed him his small patch of land. The king was not a commander-in-chief, but the conductor of an orchestra where each musician had their own sheet music and could decide to go home after the first symphony. In practice, this meant that to go to war, a king had to summon his vassals, negotiate, remind them of their oaths, and pray they would show up. And if the campaign dragged on, he had to start paying them, turning his feudal army into a mercenary one. This system created temporary, fragmented armies, based on personal obligation, not national duty. But even if a king managed, through charisma or money, to hold everyone together for longer, he faced a far more relentless enemy than a rebellious noble: the empty stomachs of his soldiers. We have already seen that getting a nobleman to show up for battle was a legal headache. But once you had him, with his men and his horses, the real challenge began. The most formidable enemy of a medieval king was not another king, but the stomach of his own army. Let's imagine a modest army for the time: 5,000 men and about 2,000 horses, between knights' mounts and beasts of burden. Do you know how much food that is? Every day, that army needed to consume more than 20 tons of food and fodder. 20 tons daily. That is the weight of 3 African elephants every 24 hours. Now try to move that amount of food. Roman roads were a distant memory, and the new roads were, for the most part, muddy tracks. Your vehicles were ox-drawn carts that, with luck, would cover 25 kilometers on a good day. This created a logistical tail, a very slow and vulnerable serpent of supplies that stretched for kilometers, and which, ironically, also needed to eat. Each draft animal consumed part of the load it was carrying. The alternative was to live off the land, that is, to plunder and requisition food as they advanced. But this had a brutal limit. An army, even a small one, was like a plague of locusts. It would exhaust the resources of a region in a matter of days, forcing it to constantly be on the move. You could not keep 20,000 men in one place for long without causing a massive famine, whether in enemy territory or, even worse, in your own. In the Third Crusade, Frederick Barbarossa's immense army largely disintegrated not because of battles, but from hunger and disease while crossing Anatolia. Logistics devoured them. This dilemma was a cage. It limited the army's size, the duration of campaigns, and the distance they could travel. But this leads us to an even more fundamental question. If an army consumed entire fields to survive, who was supposed to be working those fields to begin with?
A king might have a golden crown and a sword of shining steel, but an inescapable truth governed his world. If his peasants were not in the fields for the harvest, his kingdom would starve. We have already discussed logistics and feudal obligations, but now we come to the most relentless tyrant of the Middle Ages, the agricultural calendar. Consider medieval demographics. More than 90% of the population worked the land. They were not just another resource, they were the economic engine and the only guarantee of survival. Pulling tens of thousands of men from their farms was not like recruiting from a factory today. It was tearing the heart out of the productive system at its most critical moment. A feudal lord could summon his vassals, but if he did so in the midst of the spring planting or during the vital late summer harvest, he was committing economic suicide. The military campaign might be a success, but victory would taste like ashes if they returned to find empty granaries and a population starving through the winter. This created a very specific window for warfare, known as the campaigning season, which typically ran from late spring to early autumn, avoiding the peaks of agricultural labor. The 100 Years' War, for example, was not a century of uninterrupted combat. It consisted of a series of seasonal campaigns. English armies would conduct devastating raids, the famous chevauchées, during the summer, and then retreat or settle into winter quarters. War would halt, not always because of a treaty, but because the soldiers, mostly peasants, had to return home to harvest the wheat. The implication is brutal. Total war was impossible.
For the vast majority of combatants, war was a summer job. Once the leaves began to change color, the absolute priority was to return home, not out of cowardice, but for survival. This agricultural rhythm was the unwritten law that dictated the size and duration of almost every army. But what happened when a force more powerful than hunger came into play? What happened when faith promised paradise, or when money made it possible to hire men who had no lands to harvest?
At this point, with logistics being a nightmare, the feudal system so restrictive, and the countryside demanding its workers, raising a large army seems impossible. But what if I told you that sometimes it did happen? Welcome to the exceptions that prove the rule. The first great driving force for mobilizing the masses was something far more powerful than loyalty to a king: faith. Consider the First Crusade. Suddenly, the question was not, what does my Lord compel me to do, but rather, am I willing to fight for the salvation of my soul? This transcendental cause broke down the feudal barriers. Nobles, knights, artisans, and even peasants, tens of thousands of people, left everything behind to march to the Holy Land. They were not fighting for a 40-day contract. They were fighting for an eternal reward. Religious fervor acted like a gigantic magnet, gathering a multinational force unthinkable for a conventional war between two neighboring kingdoms. The second driving force was more earthly but just as effective: cold, hard cash. As the Middle Ages progressed and the economy became more monetized, kings and great lords discovered that loyalty could be bought. Thus was born the professional soldier, the mercenary. These men were not tied to the harvest calendar or to feudal oaths. Their only loyalty was to whoever filled their purse. In the later stages of the 100 Years' War, for example, armies of thousands of mercenaries, such as the famous Free Companies, became the backbone of the English and French forces. A king with enough gold could keep a larger army in the field for much longer than one based solely on his vassals. Both faith and pay offered a solution to these major problems. The one provided an inexhaustible motivation that eclipsed worldly obligations. The other created a professional warrior class that did not need to return home for the harvest. But even these large armies, which remained the exception, faced a tactical reality that defined medieval warfare far more than clashes in the open field.
Okay, we've talked about logistics, peasants, feudal contracts, but we're missing the key question. What were these armies used for? If you're thinking of epic open field battles like in the movies, let me tell you that wasn't the norm. Medieval warfare wasn't a large-scale jousting tournament. It was, for the most part, something much slower, more strategic, and brutal: a war of sieges. Power in the Middle Ages wasn't located in a capital city, but in hundreds of castles and walled towns. Each castle was a node of control over the territory, its people, and its resources. To conquer a region, you didn't need to annihilate the enemy army in a pitched battle, something incredibly risky, where you could lose everything in a single afternoon. What you needed was to take their castles, one by one. And for that, a gigantic army is often a hindrance. What good are 20,000 men if only 2,000 can effectively surround a fortress? The rest just consume food, spread diseases, and wait. For a successful siege, you didn't need a horde, but specialized forces: engineers to build catapults, miners to dig tunnels, and disciplined troops capable of enduring months of campaigning. The other side of the coin was economic warfare, the famous chevauchée. This consisted of launching fast, destructive raids into enemy territory. The objective wasn't to conquer, but to paralyze. Burning crops, sacking villages, and terrorizing the population so that the opposing feudal lord couldn't collect taxes or feed his troops. For this, again, speed was crucial. A small, mounted force was far more effective than a slow, predictable mass. A master of this was the Black Prince during the 100 Years' War. His famous chevauchées through France didn't seek battle, but to ruin the French king, forcing him to fight at a disadvantage. So in most cases, the war wasn't won with a glorious cavalry charge, but by the engineer who aimed a trebuchet well, or the horseman who set fire to the enemy's barn. It was a war of attrition and control, not annihilation. This system, centered on the castle and the land, defined military strategy for centuries. But what happens when a technology arrives that can shatter the thickest walls, and a new type of king emerges with the power to change the rules of the game forever?
We have seen that medieval warfare was a delicate balance, a puzzle of feudal loyalties, ox carts, and the tyranny of the harvests. But in the late Middle Ages, three unstoppable forces collided to shatter that game board and change it forever. The first was the centralization of power. Kings, tired of begging their nobles for 40 days of service, found a much more effective solution: money. They created the first national tax systems. Suddenly, they no longer needed to ask for favors. They could pay for an army. And a soldier you pay a salary to doesn't go home when the harvest is over. He is loyal to you, not to his local lord. The concept of a professional, standing army was born, loyal not to a duke, but to the state. The second force was the roar of gunpowder. For centuries, a noble's power resided in his castle, an almost impregnable fortress that made war a long and tedious game of sieges. But then came the cannons. These metal beasts, incredibly expensive and difficult to move, could do in days what took an army months: bring down stone walls. Think of the end of the 100 Years' War. The French king Charles VII, funded by new taxes, created a professional army equipped with a formidable artillery train. With these cannons, he systematically reconquered the English castles in Normandy and Gascony. The era of the knight defending his fief from his battlements was coming to an end. And here is the key. Who could afford these very expensive cannons and pay for standing armies? Only kings with the power to collect taxes throughout an entire country. Power shifted from local nobles to a central government. Gunpowder did not just bring down castles, it demolished the very structure of feudalism. The medieval army, small, temporary, and based on personal obligations, evaporated. In its place, the modern army was born, large, permanent, state-funded, and ready to fight on a much, much larger game board.